Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. Welcome to our Friends of the Everglades live event. This is our first event of 2023, and we're going to have a really good discussion today about the upcoming state legislative session that begins this coming Tuesday in Tallahassee. There's always a lot to track. This year is no exception, and we have some great guests to break it all down for us and help us understand what's happening in our state capitol. Before we dive in, I want to thank our sponsors for this live stream, the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation. Very grateful for their support of not just this live stream event, but our legislative accountability work. Friends of the Everglades launched a new section on our website, everglades.org, dedicated to legislative accountability. We know how hard it can be for people to understand and track legislation, especially when hundreds of bills are filed. And Representative Cross, who's joined us and I'll introduce in a minute, has to keep pace with all of that on the front lines. But check out our new section on our site, everglades.org, if you'd like to have a more digestible dose of the legislative action, and we'll keep you posted there. So let me introduce our guests, and one of them will be joining us late. But first, we have Representative Lindsay Cross. Lindsay is a member of the Florida House of Representatives for the 60th District, and she's also a former environmental advocate. And I'd venture to say she still would proclaim that she's one within the halls of the state capitol. So welcome today, Representative Cross.
Thank you so much, Eve and Gil. And yes, I will always be an environmental advocate, regardless of what other hats I'm wearing.
Thank you for that. And that is a huge part of the reason we invited you to join us today to preview the legislative session. Next, we have Gil Smart. Gil wears two hats, actually. He's here as Executive Director of Vote Water, and he also serves as Policy Director for Friends of the Everglades. Welcome, Gil.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks. And we'll be joined shortly by Representative Anna Escamani. She's a member of the House of Representatives from the 47th District in Orange County. She's juggling multiple events, so she's going to pop in as soon as she's done speaking at another event and join us for a good conversation today. So let me just start with kind of some broad comments about the legislative session, where we were last year, where we are now, and what we're looking at. So last year, from our perspective at Friends of the Everglades and Vote Water as well, the big issue was water management. There was a terrible bill that really mobilized the masses. It was Senate Bill 2508. It would have preserved the status quo, to oversimplify things. And the public really mobilized and opposed that bill. And we ended up killing that bill. Many different organizations fought in Tallahassee. Gil traveled there, and we had a success on that front last year. It was a very consuming game of defense. So this year, so far, and the session doesn't start until Tuesday, but what we're seeing so far is that growth and growth management is shaping up to be a really urgent issue in the Capitol. There's been an onslaught of bills that Gil is going to walk us through that would undermine smart growth management in Florida, and a couple of good bills too that we want to shine a light on. And we're also going to talk about another bill that doesn't directly relate to growth, but was just filed yesterday and is really concerning. It would undermine the ability of cities and counties to regulate water pollution, adopt policies that would address water pollution and also protect wetlands and things of that nature. So we want to spend some time talking about that. And before I kind of open it up for our discussion here, a couple more points. Friends of the Everglades several weeks ago released our legislative priorities for this session this year. And there are 4 categories of them. I'm not going to go into detail now. You can go to our website to check them out. But they boil down to cleaner water, and we have specific steps that we want the state legislature to take to address that. More wetlands to send more clean water south from Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades. Smarter controlled development. We're definitely going to talk about that one today. And stop sugarcane burning. So that's where we are. And for those of you who are joining us live, thank you for being here. We'll get to some Q&A at the end of this hour. So please chime in the comments if you have questions. If you're on Facebook or if you're on YouTube, we can see your questions when you pop them in live, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So let me stop there. And I want to turn to you first, Representative Cross. just to give us a little color before we dive into the nitty gritty policy details about what it's been like your first stint in public office to shift to environmental advocacy to being a lawmaker, what roadblocks have you encountered? Give us the lay of the land.
Thank you for that question. When you asked about a little color, the first thing I was thinking is blue, green, and red, blue, green algae and red tide. That's certainly some color that we're trying to address this year, but maybe not going about it the best way. So I was fortunate to work up in the halls of Tallahassee for the past couple sessions as an advocate for clean water, for smart growth, for resiliency. And making this shift, the biggest change is that I am now looking at so many different issues, not just clean water and conservation and environmental related things, but and that's one of the exciting things, is being able to better understand so many different important issues throughout our state, whether that's education or healthcare, and addressing other things that are important to people in our state besides just clean water. But that is something that touches everyone. I wouldn't say that there's been any stumbling blocks yet, but I'm working on getting to know a lot of the freshman legislators, because we have a large freshman class, understanding what people's interests are and where there's common ground. Clean water and a healthy environment is something that is supported by the majority of Floridians and many of our lawmakers as well. So I'm trying to find alliances where I can, and make sure that I'm able to share my experience, both as an environmental scientist, someone who's worked on communications and policy, when I'm in committees and in one-on-one discussions with other legislators.
Thank you for your previous work with Florida Conservation Voters, really valuable organization, and it has mattered, and I'm so glad it can inform your work as a lawmaker. You mentioned red tide and blue-green algae. So are you seeing effects of red tide in your district in the St. Petersburg
Yes,
area?
we are.
A little bit about that?
Yes. So the district that I represent is 60, and it includes, it's more Tampa Bay than it is Gulf Coast. It's portions of St. Petersburg and Pinellas Park. And much of this area is neighborhoods and homes and businesses that are on the shores of Tampa Bay. But I do spend a lot of time out on the beaches and the canals. I'm part of an outrigger canoe crew. And when I'm in district, go out every Sunday morning and paddle. And just this last Sunday, a couple days ago, we ran into hundreds of dead fish in one of the residential canals. As we're starting to get to Johns Pass near Madeira Beach. There were reports of red tide, and looking at the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's website, their red tide page, there are bloom conditions in several different counties. I think they had about 75 samples where red tide was detected, with several of them in bloom conditions. And I can report firsthand that there are fish kills. A couple of my crew members were coughing on the boat. When I posted a Instagram live video about that, I had comments from people that said, I was wondering if red tide was back because I was hearing people coughing, and they were talking about respiratory irritation just this weekend. And so, yes, it is here. It's not something that we usually have in February. So it's a very discouraging.
Thank you for providing that insight. We've been tracking it, especially in Southwest Florida, because it's part of the greater Everglades ecosystem. And we also are really concerned about the hot spots we're seeing this early in the season, combined with the fact that we're getting discharges from Lake Okeechobee, both east and west. And we know from research that fuels these blooms and can cause them to stick around longer. And then on top of that, there's a predicted blue-green algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee this spring and summer. In fact, we're already seeing microcystin on the St. Lucie side of the lake. So that creates a lot of urgency, I would hope, to address the issues that we're going to talk about during this conversation. So thanks for that backdrop. Gil, I'm going to turn it now to you to give an overview of the bills we're tracking. The good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. So
there's always a lot of bad and ugly, unfortunately. This year is no change from that. We're going to save, I'll call it the worst for last, which is you referenced at the top of the hour here the fact that just yesterday there was a particularly heinous bill filed that would essentially cut the legs out from under any municipality or county that attempts to regulate clean water, wetlands, beyond what the state does. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That's a bit of an outlier because so far this session, there have actually not been a whole lot of legislative proposals filed that sort of directly impact the issue, sort of clean water, or what we can do about it. We got some good stuff, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And Rep. Cross is a sponsor of one of the better bills that we prefer out there. Well, maybe she can talk a little bit about that when we get there. But we are calling this the session of sprawl because it almost seems as if it's a coordinated attempt by the sprawl industry to sort of run roughshod over the regulations and sort of fill the playing field even more in their favor. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I'll put together a little bit of a slideshow. If I can figure this out, share screen. Okay, are we seeing this? Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, here we go. All right. I will call this again the session of sprawl. There's a lot of bills out there which would, as it says here, sabotaging sound planning, shutting down citizens, rubber stamping irresponsible growth. We've got House Bill 41, Senate Bill 856, prohibits local initiatives or referendums on land development regulations. Your municipality adopts a land development regulation that allows for, to build something that might not have otherwise been permitted. You go out there, you try to file a referendum on that. You're not going to be able to do it if this bill passes. This one, House Bill 359, Senate Bill 540, is kind of one of the worst ones out there and emblematic of what's going on this session. Citizens, so if your county passes an amendment to the comprehensive plan and you don't like it, citizens can sue. They can file an administrative challenge. And the way that it works now is if you lose that suit, well, you lose the suit and you got to pay your attorney's fees. But this would change things so that if a citizen files a suit and loses, the citizen would be on the hook for the other side's legal fees. They would have to pay the prevailing party legal fees. That's the developer and or the local government. The obvious implication there is this is going to intimidate citizens who might otherwise challenge sort of questionable comprehensive plan amendments, virtually all of which tend to be pretty controversial and some people would say ripe for challenge. This is going to make it a lot less easy for people to challenge because they take a risk if they do that.
Yep. Hi, Representative Escamani. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Sorry I'm late. Excited to be here.
That's okay. You're just in time. Gil's walking us through the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's
mostly
been
the bad.
filed.
Right. The bad and the ugly goes on for a lot longer than the good.
And Gil,
Thank you, Gil.
before you move on from that last one, Gil, I just want to mention that there's already provision in state law that prohibits frivolous lawsuits from being filed in this regard. So, we got some feedback from people who said, well, this might be good because we don't want these people to file frivolous lawsuits and others to pay attorney fees, but that is already addressed. Let's be clear. This bill is not necessary. It would just stifle citizen challenges. And in many cases, that's going to lead to bad development. So
right.
Just wanted to add that.
All right. Moving on, there's a number of proposals out there which would drastically shorten the time local governments have to deal with development proposals. House Bill 383, Senate Bill 346 gives local governments just 180 days to review proposed zoning changes and other development orders unless the developer agrees to an extension. And speaking with folks who work for sort of county municipal governments, they're saying, look, this puts us over a barrel. We're going to have to do one of two things. We're either going to have to hire additional staff to meet these deadlines, or we're not going to be able to really scrutinize these proposals. If we got to shove them through the pipeline that quickly, there's basically going to be no other option for this. So that facilitates more reckless planning. Like I said, it just shoves more stuff through the pipeline, won't be properly vetted unless, your municipality is prepared to hire a whole slate of new people and maybe jack up your taxes in order to pay for it. House Bill 671, 682 reduces the time a local government has to approve or deny building permits from 30 business days to 9 calendar days. Again, it's an unfunded mandate, puts local governments up against the wall and basically gives them a choice, beef up or, don't scrutinize these proposals, you're not going to have time to do it. More sprawl, more problems. House Bill 439 is almost humorous in that it redefines sprawl as merely unplanned development requiring the extension of public facilities. So, you can build like 5 strip malls in a row with a Chick-fil-A in each one, and that's not sprawl, right? It ends local government's ability to deny zoning changes because there aren't enough roads, schools, or other infrastructure to support the development. And it changes the definition of density. It requires that it be based on the number of residential units, not residents. So like previously, the zoning designations might say, max out at 1,000 residents per acre. Well, here it would have to be 1,000 residential units per acre. And of course, most of those are going to have more than one people. So you're bumping up your density significantly. House Bill 397 allows local governments to meet privately with developers who make a Burt Harris Private Property Rights Act claim, allowing for backroom deals. Senate Bill 170 allows local governments to prepare business impact estimate, requires local government to prepare such an estimate before enacting certain ordinances. It basically makes it easier as another way for businesses to sue local governments. So, again, there's a lot of these things they all go in the same direction, which is, again, they're tilting the playing field in favor of the sprawl industry, pushing stuff through the pipeline with less scrutiny. Sort of like the sword of Damocles hanging over the municipal heads here if we're going to make more ways for businesses to sue you. It's basically pushing local governments up against the wall and the sprawl industry saying, basically, we're going to do what we want. That's kind of what this amounts to in sum. So, there's a lot of bad ideas out there in that respect this year. There are, however, some bright spots out there. House Bill 175, Senate Bill 192. This has to do with the Everglades protection area. Requires comprehensive plan and plan amendments regarding certain lands within 2 miles of the EPA to follow a state coordinated review process. Requires FDEP to review the changes for adverse impact and work with local governments. This would stem largely from the controversy down in Miami-Dade over the expansion of the UDB, the urban development boundary down there. We've got kind of a picture of that here to sort of help illustrate. But, again, anything that's going to, require more scrutiny and more care when it comes to the Everglades protection area, we're definitely in favor of that. Here's one. I rep across as a co-sponsor of this. Stopping blue-green algae requires the inspection of on-site treatment systems, requires estimated pollutant load reductions in the BMAPs to meet or exceed requirements. Some additional preview or some additional measures having to do with BMAPs. These were among the ideas proposed by the state's blue-green algae task force, which were not enacted into law. This would enact them into law. So we're definitely in favor of that, given that we may be facing down another summer of slime here on the East Coast. House Bill 843, and I believe this is also Rep. Cross's bill, requires a prevailing party to show that a development order challenge was frivolous before the prevailing party can recover attorney fees and costs. So that's a step in the right direction. That's empowering citizens rather than disempowering citizens. Safer Waterways Act, this was filed last year and went nowhere. It's kind of a no-brainer. I'm not sure why it went nowhere. Requires the owners of public bathing places to notify county health departments where contamination by fecal bacteria is present. Biosolids, this was an interesting one. It limits the land application of Class B biosolids unless it could be demonstrated it would not add to nutrient loading. Single-use plastics authorizes coastal communities to establish pilot programs to regulate single-use plastics like bags and water bottles. It's a good idea. And then there's a number of bills we're watching, including several bills that involve appropriations from the State Land Acquisition Trust Fund. You can see House Bill 135, Senate Bill 54 would use some of that money for the Florida Keys area critical state concern. We're particularly interested in this side of the state on HB 547, Senate Bill 320, provides a $50 million annual appropriations for projects related to the Indian River Lagoon Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. The Indian River Lagoon has a lot of problems, and actually Governor DeSantis in his executive order, I believe, called for $100 million for this purpose. And then House Bill 559 requires at least $350 million annually from the Land Acquisition Trust Fund of the Florida Forever program. So I think that's essentially it. I wanted to add on whilst we're here. Okay, now we're back. The best for the worst for last. This is what Eve referenced at the top of the hour. Senate Bill 1240 and House Bill 1197. These bills are titled Land and Water Management. You might title them Land and Water Mismanagement. It says, in effect, the county or municipality may not adopt laws, regulations, rules, or policies relating to water quality, water quantity, pollution control, pollutant discharge prevention or removal, wetlands, including any delineation, and the regulation of water quality, water quantity, pollution control, pollutant discharge prevention, removal, and wetlands, including any delineation, is exclusively preempted to the state. Now, Martin County, where Eve and I are sitting right now, has a very strict wetlands ordinance. Basically, in the unincorporated county, you can't destroy wetlands. It looks like this bill would scuttle that and would allow for the destruction of wetlands in Martin County. There's a lot of questions. Some municipalities may have really stringent stormwater rules. Now, the bill specifically spells out that the authority of a county or municipality to regulate and operate its own stormwater system is exempted. But does that include, is that just the county-owned system, or is that if local developments, are required to run their own system? I mean, does it have to be part of the county infrastructure to be affected by that? There's a lot of questions for this bill. The biggest question is, why was it filed? Because this is ridiculous. This is ludicrous. This does nothing but undermine local attempts to improve water quality. We know that the state, attempt to improve water quality, the premier pollution control program, the Basin Management Action Plan, or BMAPs, are pretty much an abysmal failure throughout the state. They're not working. We're not reaching pollutant reduction standards. It stands to reason that local governments, as in Martin County, where the county values conservation, the people of this county value conservation. They want wetlands protected. And now we're going to say you can't do that. It's ludicrous, and all it's going to do, and it does lead back to sprawl, right? On wetlands in particular, if all of a sudden we can destroy wetlands, well, guess what that permits? Guess what that allows? It allows uses, intensities that we're not seeing now. And so it will lead to more sprawl. It does lead back to that. So.
Yeah, thank you, Gil. Really helpful overview. And I don't think we're crying wolf in articulating this as the session of sprawl, potentially, but we're still hopeful that we can stop that outcome since session hasn't even started yet. So Representative Cross, I'm going to turn it to you, and then we're going to turn to Representative Escamani. You filed two of the bills, as Gil alluded, that we do support, implementation of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations, and also the bill on prevailing attorney's fees. Can you tell us a little bit about why you filed those and what the prognosis is?
Sure. So having the experience of being an advocate for the environment the past couple of years, I've been able to see some of the bills that have been proposed in the past couple sessions. I've also been involved with monitoring task forces and rule development that's happening at the state level through Department of Environmental Protection and other entities. The Blue-Green Algae Task Force implementation bill, I think, is one of the most important ones that we need to act on. This is a bill that's already been filed 2 years in a row. It's had Senate and House sponsors each of those years. And it simply looks at a couple of the key recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force and says, let's start making progress on these. When Governor DeSantis was sworn in for his first session, one of the first things he did was bring a group of experts together in the Blue-Green Algae Task Force to make recommendations to him and his administration about how we can curb this problem, which is becoming chronic, which is affecting people's public health. It's affecting our economic health, and really just the long-term viability of Florida as being, one of the most attractive places to live and visit and do business. After that task force was meeting, they came up with a short, succinct document in 2019 of around 40 recommendations, focused mostly on pollution prevention, because that's where our efforts really need to be, making sure those pollutants, whether it's nitrogen or sediments or fecal matter, aren't getting into the water in the first place, rather than trying to work on these expensive cleanup tactics afterwards. Very few of those recommendations have been implemented. So this bill looks at a statewide septic inspection program. We've got about 2.7 million septic systems throughout our state, and those are both in rural and urban areas. So the Miami-Dade area has homes on canals that are on septic, and with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, there's salt water going right into those septic systems. So we know that they're not doing their intended job. The first thing we need to do is get a handle on how big that problem is and where we need to make improvements, either upgrades to the septic systems or being able to convert them to sewer and advanced wastewater treatment where that's available. And then, as Gil alluded to, the basin management action plans need improvements. And so this bill recommends improvements to that process, including looking at the projects that are going to have the greatest pollutant load reductions. We don't have endless resources at the state, the local, or the federal level. And so we need to be putting our taxpayer dollars into the projects that are going to be the most effective, have the monitoring to back that up. And we also need to be looking more closely at what this future population growth is going to do to our water quality, because if we already have water bodies across the state that are impaired, they're too dirty for people to swim in or to fish in, which are some of our metrics. If we're adding 800 or more people a day, that water quality is only going to get worse and worse. So those are a few of those simple, maybe not simple, but common sense things that we need to implement. The House Bill 843 related to the challenges to the development orders. What this does is it does not change the prevailing party attorney fees, but it prevents third-party interveners from being able to claim that money. So if there's a citizen group that's challenging a development order and there's a lawsuit between them and their city, if the city wins, they can still recoup some of those attorney fees. But if there's a third party, such as a developer, that voluntarily gets involved in that lawsuit, they should not be able to avail themselves of those fees, because that is just significantly increasing the potential financial burden of those residents, those citizen groups that just want to make sure that that we're maintaining our environmental integrity and the health of our communities.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. Two good bills that Friends of the Everglades and Vote Water support. Well, are you hearing support for them from your colleagues in Tallahassee?
I think that there will be more likelihood that we have traction with the blue-green algae bill than the development order one, because we have seen that same bad precedent moving into comprehensive plan amendments. I think folks thought like, oh, this works so well with development orders, let's extend it to comprehensive plans amendments.
Right.
Do you think
Do
you think this, if we get a significant algae blooms this year, red tide on the West Coast, blue-green algae on the East Coast, I mean, do you think that gives the bill additional sort of traction? Do you think it's going to make it seem all that much more urgent?
Yes and no. We always have to react to catastrophic events that we saw. A couple of years ago when we had the massive red tide bloom in Tampa Bay because of the Piney Point spill, you would think if there's any time that we're going to see traction on this and proactive legislation, that it would be then. And still, we have not seen anything that is adequately addressing that problem. But we can't continue to ignore this situation, particularly when our population is just exploding.
Yeah, well put. Thank you. Representative Escamani, I want to invite you to comment on anything you just heard about bills that are pending. And then I also would like to hear from you about the renewable energy bill you filed this session.
Oh, I would love to, Eve. And again, just such an honor to share space with everyone, and especially to be in the Florida House with Rep. Cross. I'm just so grateful to have an environmental champion, but also an environmental expert, with us. It adds so much to our efforts in the Florida Legislature, because I find that so many of the biggest fights, our challenge is just the knowledge gap. And unfortunately, many lawmakers will kind of go towards industry to provide them with perspective, and they don't always know who the advocate is or even think to talk to an advocate. So the fact that we have an advocate in the chamber makes a huge, huge difference for Mama Earth and for the state of Florida. So just always humbling to serve with you, Rep. Cross. And in particular, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, so freaking important. And I just wanted to add to Rep. Cross's point about, we've had these other catastrophic events with very little action. I just want to add to that, the die-off of manatees should also spur, some sort of activity, especially around implementing those recommendations and trying to reduce nitrates. And yet, despite manatees dying and continuing to die, into this new year, we still don't see that type of momentum or that energy. So it's definitely very frustrating. I think the session of sprawl is so well stated. Just preemption is coming back, in many different versions, as Gil already talked about. And just to that point, I want to add water quality issues do seem to be a part of the Florida House's focus this year. I serve alongside our cross on several committees that are just focused on infrastructure, water quality, hurricane resilience, so forth. I've not seen, direction from that policy wise, but I know the conversation is happening. And I've heard that our speaker wants to prioritize water issues. So we will see what that looks like. Obviously, we've had bills in the past that were titled clean water that were not focused on that, right? So we have to be really critical of the history to this and ensure that what comes out of the chamber actually is in the best interest of our state. I don't, Gil, do you want to add anything to that? I saw you unmute yourself, so I want to be sensitive.
No, I think you're right. I think,
Okay.
we can call it clean water, but is it actually clean water? And then that's
Right.
where, that's where we come in, organizations like Friends of the Everglades and Vote Water sort of take a closer look at some of this stuff, because it's, you can call it whatever you want it, but at the end of the day, is it actually getting it done? So.
Amen. Absolutely. Real quick, just to go back to the heart of your question, Eve, about renewable energy goals. So I am very proud to, be an advocate and also just someone who tries to be informed, on energy policy. I do a lot of work around utility rates and the Public Service Commission, and really trying to ensure that we're holding these different state actors accountable. And of course, a part of that is, Florida transitioning to clean energy economy, which, as many folks know, despite being the Sunshine State, we're not leading when it comes to solar. We were able to fight back against a very dangerous bill last session that would have just decimated the rooftop solar industry. And that was the net metering bill that the governor actually vetoed, thanks to the advocates of folks who are tuned in today. And so our bill, which is also filed by Senator Lori Berman on the Senate side, is House Bill 957. And that's our renewable energy goals legislation. It would not only set renewable energy goals for Florida, but also carbon neutrality goals by a certain year. We're aiming for 2040 as the benchmark, but it also does include a creation of jobs. And we were very inspired by what Illinois did in the energy transition, because one of the pushbacks we always hear from folks regarding energy policy and getting off fossil fuels is, well, we have jobs and we don't want to lose those jobs. And what Illinois has proven to us is that the clean energy economy can include no one losing their jobs, but actually creating new jobs that are much less volatile and also either the same pay or even better pay. So part of our bill would actually include the creation of navigators to help members of the fossil fuel workforce actually transition to clean energy jobs. And it also creates a task force with multiple stakeholders, including industry and labor voices alongside academia. We also would pause the construction of any new fossil fuel infrastructure, because, this is another way that utility companies kind of keep us locked down, is they keep building fossil fuel infrastructure and then they'll say, well, we have bonds on this, we have to use this to pay for it. And it's like, okay, well, just let's build clean energy infrastructure, stop building more fossil fuel infrastructure. So things like, banning fracking and so forth are also part of our bill. So it's a pretty cool omnibus package. Of course, the tone legislature is very difficult for such a package to move. But I think it's very important as advocates that we provide the contrast to the world that we want and what is possible if we are committed to taking real action on not just climate, but also getting us away from the volatility of fossil fuels, being more energy independent and secure, and also improving efficiency, which reduces costs for consumers.
Thanks for explaining that. I looked at the text of your bill and was really struck by the part that states, without exception, the drilling or exploration for or production of oil, gas, or other petroleum products are prohibited on the lands and waters of the state. So we've had an imminent threat regarding oil drilling in the Everglades and Big Cypress. So that kind of language would just take that threat off the table. Let's stop fighting ridiculous, damaging proposals and move on in a more productive direction. So thank you for that, and we wish you luck on that. I want to ask you one more question, Representative Eskamani, about a bill that you filed last year that Friends of the Everglades also was supportive of. This would have repealed an expansion of the right to farm bill related to sugarcane burning. And of course, that actually does contribute carbon to the atmosphere. It's not the biggest source, but it is a source. But more importantly, that expansion of the right to farm bill removed the rights from residents to sue over the negative impacts of sugarcane burning. And we know more than ever about the air pollution and the health risks posed by this practice, primarily south of Lake Okeechobee. So unfortunately, that bill didn't get any traction. Can you talk a little bit about that issue and if you see it going anywhere in the future?
Yeah, I love to, Eve. It's also a good reminder for me to inform folks of changes to House rules, which is preventing us from filing repealers this year. So just as a quick reminder, state House representatives like myself and Rep. Cross, we actually have a bill limit. We can only file 7 bills every session. Senators have unlimited bill slots, but we're restricted in just 7. Historically, repealers, which is basically a bill that removes language from statute, we could file without it impacting our bill limit. But this year, House Republicans changed the rules where repealers count towards your bill slot. So unfortunately, this repeal that I filed last session, alongside a repeal that would have restored the option for local governments to have rights of nature ordinances, I won't be able to file them again this year because I don't have enough bill slots. So it's definitely very frustrating because even just the conversation is restricted with this new rule, which is why I voted no on the rules. And, I think actually every member of the minority caucus did. But it just speaks to how our tools have been decreased, if you will, and trying to fight back and also be proactive. But to the heart of your question again, it's such an important issue that impacts very marginalized communities. And this is unfortunately all too common where our low wealth communities, our people of color neighborhoods, and areas of concentrated disadvantage also experience environmental harm. And in the case of burning sugarcane, ProPublica has did really important investigative research where we're seeing how this is impacting air quality. It's increasing asthma rates of kids in these neighborhoods. And the legislature, instead of addressing these air quality issues, actually doubled down in taking away the ability for residents to sue for health hazards, which is getting worse right now. There was a major tort package that passed its first House stop on Friday. It's so extreme of a package that even a Republican vote against it, that would make it very difficult for folks to seek any justice from issues of negligence, intersecting with corporate decision making. So we're actually seeing the situation become worse when it comes to just holding corporate actors accountable to damaging our environment or damaging our air quality. And this was one of those examples. And so, the other option, right, is if FDOCS, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, implemented rulemaking and actually took these concerns seriously. But unfortunately, it never happened in the last 4 years. And I feel like it's highly unlikely for the new commissioner. But those are the avenues we're going to push for and try to build some momentum around transitioning to green harvesting and away from sugarcane burning.
Right. That's very well put. And thanks for mentioning tort, which is going to be a big issue this session and does have environmental implications. You're absolutely right. All right. So, Gil, I want to turn back to you now to talk about Governor DeSantis's executive order on the environment. He came out with an executive order back in January. And one part of it, we're not going to go through the whole thing, but one part of it does call for some improvements in terms of smart growth management. And the commitments are vague, the language is vague, but these bills that we're talking about that have been filed during what could be the session of sprawl seem to fly in the face of that. Can you tell us about that contrast? And you're muted, Gil.
Sorry about that. And that was my best stuff. You guys missed it all. Governor DeSantis' executive order, we did a pretty thorough analysis on it at Low Water. And, there's some good stuff in there, right? I mean, there's a lot of money that's being invested in, Everglades restoration projects and other projects as well. I mean, we might quibble around the details of some of that. But there was some very interesting stuff in there just in terms of other development, issues. Let me see if I can find the exact wording here. Okay, he wants he's ordering the DEP to partner with the Department of Economic Opportunity and local governments to improve local government long-term comprehensive planning that ensures sustainable growth while protecting our natural resources, including prioritizing sewer connections and advanced wastewater systems that can sustain increased population demands and protecting taxpayer investments in Everglades restoration in major land country. But anyway, here he's telling DEP to work with the DEO to improve local government long-term planning. I would ask how any of the bills that we cited, under the Session of Sprawl banner here, how any of that improves local planning. None of it does. In fact, all of it goes the exact opposite direction. Undercuts local planning. It certainly undercuts citizen participation. It undercut you, and by doing so, you remove sort of a crucial check and balance on the whole process, on the whole planning process. So these bills, these legislators, almost seem to be going directly against what the governor himself said he wanted in the executive order. That's pretty gutsy, I think. I don't know that they've thought about it that way, but perhaps they should. I mean, again, when the governor is specifically calling for strengthening local community planning, which I think we would agree wholeheartedly with, because frankly, as Rep. Cross has said, Florida's still adding about like 800 people a day. If we're going to continue to do this, and all indications are that we are going to continue to do that, we absolutely, positively have to have ironclad, cautious, very careful planning across the board in Florida. We can't just shove all the sausage, into the casing and out the door. We can't do it. We cannot do that without major, significant impacts on water quality, on wetlands, on wildlife habitat. Across the board, you are creating tremendous impacts through reckless development. And all these bills represent more reckless development. It's not, a sort of conscientious, very cautious approach to development. It's the exact opposite. And again, it does seem to go against what the governor explicitly called for in his executive order.
Yet we're headed down a path that is going to have to involve some conflict. Either these bills are going to move forward and they're going to defy what appears to be the spirit of the governor's intentions in the executive order, in which case we would certainly hope he would veto them, or they'll get squashed, perhaps recognizing that that's not in alignment with the governor's order. So we'll see how that shapes up, and we'll keep you informed on it.
Well, and then the question becomes, if these bills wind up going to the governor's desk and the governor signs them, well, what was that line about in the executive order? How serious really was the governor about it?
Exactly. That's right. We've done accountability work on the Blue-Green Algae Task Force and collaborated with allies on a progress report. And we think it's really important to do the same thing on the governor's executive order. Let's see what the specific actions are that come from these words.
It was a major policy statement, and he obviously intended it to be a major policy statement. So, all right, let's treat it as such,
Right.
And I'd like to add that, Gil, when you talked about checks and balances, which is so important, I think the different levels of government serve that purpose as well. The Department of Environmental Protection at the state level cannot and should not be the end all and be all for environmental protection. They don't have the resources, the staffing, necessarily the local experience to know the need of every single community, every municipality, every neighborhood. That's why it's important to have strong programs at the local level, as well as strong cooperation with the federal government. We saw a couple of years ago when Florida assumed a lot of the authority to regulate the destruction of wetlands from the EPA. We saw a mega backload of requests to destroy wetlands that were coming into DEP. They could not keep up with all of those proposals. And now what they're going to do is take some of that ability from local municipalities that are doing that work. In the county just across the bay from me, Hillsborough County, they have a more aggressive wetland program than some other areas do, and actually regulate the destruction of wetlands at a smaller size, like smaller wetlands less than half an acre. And while that may not seem that important, some of these small systems are very important for amphibians, for reptiles.
Absolutely.
Even if they're only wet for, a short period each year. They're sometimes called frog ponds. They're critical to the system. They're also feeding areas for some of our wading birds as well. And so they all feed into the system. And without some of that local knowledge, we're going to see, I think, so many problems down the line, and just continuing to have deteriorated water quality.
Absolutely.
And I'll just add to that real quick too. Rep Cross mentioned this, and I just want to put like a point to it. Even with rules, enforcement is very important. And when we don't have, like you said, Rep Cross, localized staff, we don't have even like just, salaries to retain staff, then even when you have good rules, if they exist, the lack of enforcement means that a problem continues. And, where I am, I'm inland in the Orlando area, but we've seen some serious water quality issues with our local lakes. And to your point, depending on the size of the lake dictates who oversees the lake water quality. And so if you don't have, good enforcement at your county or city and no resources to do so, let alone, the state agencies, then even small problems can get really, really bad pretty quickly. And Orlando's experiencing huge amounts of growth, especially within the urban core. And we get a lot of complaints about traffic in Orlando, due to construction and road closures. But what we don't often hear about is the debris from construction, also the pipes that just cannot sustain the demand of the new, high risers. So we see sewage spills happen, lift stations fail. So there's all these other, parts of the infrastructure that, again, when we have this endless growth but no plan, can cause a great deal of damage when you least expect it. And then, it goes into, your ability to safely, walk or fish or just, exist in your neighborhood.
Yeah. It reminds me of a great piece published in Current Affairs last year called The Annihilation of Florida that Jeff Vandermeer wrote. And we certainly hope to avoid that outcome, but all of these factors do seem to be building to a breaking point. So thank you for talking about this legislation, because we're doing everything we can to stave off that fate. I have one more question for both of you, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. Just a reminder, if you're watching live, you can put your questions in the chat on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get to as many of them as we can before we wrap at 1 p.m. So I'm going to go back to something Gil said during his presentation. He mentioned several bills that address allocation of money from the Land Acquisition Trust Fund. And actually, this relates to DeSantis's executive order too, because there's a portion in his order that talks about the Indian River Lagoon. He's since proposed a budget conforming bill that would allocate $100 million from the Land Acquisition Trust Fund to lagoon projects. But not all of these projects are land acquisition or even restoration per se. So I'll be completely honest. Gil and I talk about how to evaluate what could arguably be good expenditures, but we're not sure if it jibes with the intent of Amendment 1, the Water and Land Legacy Amendment. So I'm going to start with you, Representative Cross. What do you make of all these proposals?
Yeah. So I guess the bottom line is right project, wrong funding source. The intent of the Land Acquisition Trust Fund and Amendment 1, which passed by 75% of the voters in 2014, nearly 10 years ago, really was to have water and land conservation. So that means that if you're purchasing, protecting a wetland in the surrounding area, that absolutely would qualify as a project. If you're creating corridors of land or water, that qualifies as something that's consistent with what the voters voted for. Putting that money into what we consider gray infrastructure like pipes and pumps, while that is absolutely imperative to make sure that we're improving water quality, it is not in spirit with the intention of that law. We do have general revenue. There's other funding sources. There's clean water revolving loan funds from the federal government. We need to be looking into those funds for some of those more traditional gray infrastructure projects. and not going to the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, because we know that it is absolutely critical that we protect some of these key corridors of land and water before they are developed.
Thank you.
Just to add to that real quick, Rip Cross is 100% correct. We have, I mean, every committee meeting I go to, we have someone that talks about Florida's flush budget. So the notion of tapping into a trust fund that is meant for, land, water acquisition, is just unacceptable and unnecessary, as we have other sources of revenue. We have surplus, we have the means to do that. And we had a presentation in one of our committees a few weeks ago from Amy Baker, who is the state's chief economist. And she literally said that, we're not moving fast enough to acquire enough land to meet conservation goals and needs. And of course, the land costs are getting more expensive, and it is this constant competition with developers. So if we're tapping into, trust fund dollars for other projects, then we have less money to spend to acquire this land, which we have to move fast to do, since a lot of it's getting picked up by developers. So just to echo, Rep. Cross's points, and that we have the funds, we shouldn't have to use it this way.
I think that's very well put. This isn't just quibbling over what bucket of money we're taking from. This is siphoning money from a very urgent cause that voters approved overwhelmingly in 2014. So we agree with you on that front. All right, so we're going to take some audience questions now. I want to thank our behind-the-scenes producer, Allie Hartman, our communications director. She's going to pop some questions here for us to tackle in our last few minutes together. All right, Judy asks, to Representative Cross, do you have a Senate sponsor of House Bill 423 lined up?
So, Judy, thank you for that question. It is likely that Senator Linda Stewart will file a similar bill, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force bill. She has for the past 2 years. I haven't filed, but if it is, Senator Stewart would be the most likely one. And it is important that we have bills in each chambers. Otherwise, it's not going to get approved.
And let me add a question onto that. If folks who are listening support what you're doing with that bill, what's your advice about how they can weigh in and help it get some traction?
So one of the things you could do right now is, she'll probably kill me if I say this, but trying to get the bill agenda'd on the House side. Chair Cindy Stevenson is the chair of the water quality. It's kind of a new committee. This would be the first committee stop. So that's the most important thing right now, is getting that bill heard on the House side so we can have the discussions about it. Hopefully get a unanimous vote in that committee, and then move into the Agriculture and Natural Resources Appropriations Committee from there.
Thank you for that. All right, we'll take another question. Okay, Sherry asks, how can we have preemption removed from Senate Bill 712 that was previously passed, preempting the rights of nature? I know Representative Anna Escamani filed a bill last year. How are you challenging that this year? Do you want to just give us a little of the backstory here too? Because I'm not sure everyone remembers what happened.
I would love to. And thanks for that question. So I kind of spoke to earlier the dynamics with repealer bills. So I'll touch on that again, but just the background for folks don't know. So, Senate Bill 712 was a huge omnibus bill, again, that was dubbed as like a Clean Water Act, which was incredibly misleading. It really came from industry. It wasn't something that advocates had worked on and pushed forward. And last minute amendment to this bill was preemption of rights of nature. Meanwhile, in counties across Florida, including mine in Orange County, we actually were moving to pass a rights of nature ordinance to protect some of our waterways. And the voters approved it. I mean, it was one of the most popular ordinances we've ever seen in Orange County history, bipartisan, and just exceeded all expectations. And as Orange County voters approved this rights to nature ordinance to protect some of our springs and other waterways, legislature preempted it through that bill. And so it is still a legal fight. There's been a lot of back and forth, like in the courts. But I will say the repealer we filed last session, we just don't have the bill slots to file this session because of the changes to repealers. As I mentioned earlier, Rob Cross and I only have 7 bill slots. In the past, repealers were basically exempt from that limit, and now they count as your limit. So unfortunately, we just don't have the bill slots to file repealers anymore. And, of course, important to note that we never even had any movement on it last session, and I highly doubt my colleagues in the majority party would want this to get heard because the developers are the ones who push for it. And I actually do remember when Rights of Nature was moving in Orange County, developers expressing their concerns with it and really seeing it as, a tool that would stop their projects, which candidly, that's kind of the goal, is to have a way to protect the environment so that you're not building in places that are environmentally sensitive and irresponsible. And the goal is to make sure that our waterways have a voice, because we're seeing the court structure become much more conservative in who has standing. And this is a really big issue, not just for the environment, but for multiple issues. When people go to court, they're being told by the judge that you don't have standing. And the whole point of Rights of Nature was to ensure that you could sue on behalf of protecting a body of water, even if you don't live in that body of water, or even if you, under a more traditional term, don't have standing. So the fight continues, but unfortunately, when it comes to legislature, repealing the preemption is going to require just a large scale organizing campaign, maybe even a ballot amendment, which reminds me of the, Act for Clean Water, for example, where they're trying to get a ballot amendment, which requires close to 1 million signatures for citizens. But I do think our path forward in eliminating that preemption, unless the makeup of the legislature changes dramatically, I think our main avenue is a citizen-led ballot initiative.
Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick. There is a right to clean water proposed constitutional amendment that Representative Escamani just said. Advocates are trying to get signatures to get on the ballot. They need 900,000, upwards of 900,000 signatures. The bar is much higher than it used to be. Friends of the Everglades and Vote Water, actually a petition signature point. You can swing by our offices if you're in the Stewart area, fill out a petition. We'll get that back to petition gatherers for you. Otherwise, you can go to the website and we'll pop the link in the chat for you to fill out your own petition and figure out how to get that on the ballot in 2024. It's a steep climb, but it would address the issues you're talking about. And I think Rights of Nature and right to clean water, some people dismiss it as kind of, touchy-feely tree hugger stuff, but it's really very practical. This is about legal standing in court, as you discussed, Representative Escamani, and that would really help us with a lot of our water issues and beyond. Okay, so I think we have time for another question or maybe two. Okay, Joanne asks, how are Florida residents educated about the unique ecosystem in which they live? Is the majority of the population educated to understand the importance of the Everglades to southern Florida? Oh, wow. Big question. Well, we're working on that. And Joanne, if you're watching, you are educating yourself. Thank you. And everyone else who's tuning in is absolutely educating themselves. I mean, we do outreach into schools to try to help young people understand the importance of this ecosystem and how the Everglades isn't just down at the bottom of the peninsula. It really stretches from north of Orlando in your district, Rep. Escamani, down to Florida Bay, east and west. So I think there can always be more education.
And I'd like to add quickly, I think that the majority of Floridians, particularly new Floridians, are not educated enough. When I was working at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, we helped to develop with community members, with businesses, even with the fertilizer industry at the onset, a fertilizer ordinance for our local area. Most of what we did after that was an educational campaign called Be Floridian, where we were teaching Floridians about the connection of fertilizer that gets into our waters, particularly during the rainy season, and how that's leading to dirty water, algae blooms, and really destruction of, their play areas. And so we need to continuously be educating people about that connection, being good stewards of the environment, understanding that our environment and our ecosystem here in Florida is different than where you may have come from. And you need to educate yourself and be a good steward of that environment.
That's right. And we really feel it's important at Friends of the Everglades and Vote Water to connect that educated public to policymakers to take action, to make that easy, because gosh, these bills, they're shrouded in names that don't even reflect what they actually do. And we really want to help people understand and take action. So more to
And
come.
I would add just briefly, unfortunately, a lot of Floridians only get educated when, there are problems. Events tend to educate them. And, if you talk about people in our neck of the woods here in Martin County, where we've endured blue-green algae blooms, how many people knew nothing about the issue until that stuff started showing up in the river? Well, when that stuff starts showing up in the river, that's a powerful incentive to figure out what the heck's going on, and to connect it to the policies and the policy makers that frankly made the decisions that led to this point. So, you hope it doesn't take another crisis to sort of generate greater awareness. But one thing that a crisis will do is generate greater awareness. So.
And just to add to that, and the legislature, we're trying to be more proactive in educating our members and actually visiting Florida Springs, for example. So it's shocking just how many of my colleagues have never been to a spring before. And myself and Rep. Cross, we're the chair and vice chair of the new Energy and Climate Caucus alongside Representative Rita Harris as our secretary. And we're in the process now of actually trying to schedule a tour of Wakulla Springs and to follow the path of water from Tallahassee's urban core to Wakulla Springs. And then I'm trying to organize, as the chairwoman of the Orange County Legislative Delegation, we're trying to organize a tour of Wekiva Springs in May. Because again, despite, roots in Orange County, many of my colleagues have never been to any of the springs, and even those in our backyard. So we're trying to also educate lawmakers alongside, integrating that into our schools as well.
Yeah. Great work. Absolutely. Lawmakers need to be educated too, some more than others. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up here with just some final comments and just a few seconds. I want to offer each of you the opportunity to just share a takeaway with our audience, whether it's a bill you want them to focus on or any sentiments. And I'll start with you, Representative Cross.
Well, wanted to thank you both for hosting this, and it's always a pleasure to be on with Rep. Escamani. I would just encourage Floridians to stay updated during the session and to contact your lawmakers, particularly your local elected officials. That feedback does matter. If you have the ability to come up to Tallahassee and speak either in support of good bills or against bad bills, it does make a difference. So stay engaged.
Thank you. Representative Escamani?
I will just echo that. If you can come to Tallahassee to testify for or against bills, it does make a difference. So much happens in the darkness in Tallahassee when folks just don't have the knowledge or opportunity to engage. So stay in touch with organizations like Friends of the Everglades, like Vote Water. So many groups, including the two here, do action alerts and will let you know when is the bill going to be heard. How can you get to Tallahassee to testify? So please stay engaged. Session kicks off on Tuesday, and it'll move very fast. So we just want you to be there the entire time and spread the word. Share this video with your friends and family. Let's build power together.
Love that. Gil, final words?
And when you go to Tallahassee, or if you contact your legislator, as it pertains to the session of sprawl, you might tell them, I'm concerned this is going to lead to more traffic. I'm concerned this is going to lead to more runoff. I'm concerned this is going to lead to more impervious surface. I'm concerned this is going to lead to more problems, because the reality is if these bills pass, all of that is going to come to pass. And, we talk a lot about our quality of life here in Florida. If it's the session of sprawl does turn out to be the session of sprawl, that quality of life is going to take a hit. So there's some talking points for you.
Thanks, Gil. And thank you all. This was a great conversation. We went a little over, but I think well worth it. And we'll keep in touch. Good luck on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Take care.